Picture yourself as a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt, receiving the most unsettling task of your professional life. The pharaoh's wife rests on the marble slab before you. Yet, this mummification is far from ordinary. You've been instructed to preserve her in a manner that disregards all sacred traditions you hold dear, and the underlying reason sends shivers down your spine. This wasn't a fictional scenario, it was a routine aspect of life in ancient Egypt, where intimate customs were so severe they would deeply disturb contemporary sensibilities. You might believe you understand Egyptian civilization, with its opulent treasures, grand pharaohs, and enigmatic pyramids. However, what is untypically taught is that ancient Egypt engaged in sexual practices so extreme that Victorian archaeologists actively concealed the proof. Royal children endured horrific abuse at the hands of their own relatives, and religious celebrations devolved into week-long spectacles of violence and sexual disorder. The forthcoming revelation will challenge all your preconceptions about one of history's prominent civilizations. The reality concerning Egyptian intimate customs is so unsettling that global museums endeavored to obscure the evidence for over 100 years. From 3100 BCE to 30 BCE, along the Nile's rich floodplains, Egyptians devised customs that would astound even the most progressive modern thinkers. These practices transcended mere personal gratification or sacred rites. They were intrinsically linked to cosmic regulation, divine authority, and the methodical application of sexuality as a means of political supremacy. Pharaohs were not merely rulers. They were regarded as living deities whose sexual conduct was thought to directly influence the Nile's productivity, crop yields, and the very existence of Egyptian society. This imposed immense pressure to demonstrate divine strength through progressively intense exhibitions. The corroborating information originates from temple carvings unseen by tourists, papyrus scrolls detailing practices too graphic for museum exhibition, and archaeological findings that Victorian academics intentionally kept from public sight. Upon their initial discovery of explicit depictions in Egyptian burial sites and sanctuaries, 19th-century archaeologists were so appalled that they either obliterated the proof or sequestered it in private assortments. Egyptian society functioned on the conviction that sexual vitality equated to cosmic power. Each intimate action held the potential to be a sacred rite. Every climax was a dialogue with the deities, and every sexual posture, a manifestation of devotion. This framework of belief fostered an environment where the distinctions between adoration and intimacy, between sacred obligation and individual delight, utterly dissolved. However, this cosmic approach to sexuality possessed a grim aspect. Children from distinguished families found themselves ensnared in a framework that regarded their physical selves as divine assets. Household servants endured systematic sexual mistreatment, which was deemed not merely lawful but spiritually indispensable. When circumstances deteriorated, such as the Nile failing to inundate or harvests faltering, sexual customs grew progressively frantic and brutal. The pivotal revelation occurred not during a dramatic tomb excavation, but in a serene laboratory in 1925, where Howard Carter's team performed the inaugural thorough inspection of Tutankhamun's mummy. They observed an anomaly that would perplex Egyptology for the subsequent century. The young monarch's genitalia were absent. They were neither damaged nor decomposed, but surgically excised with the exactitude of an accomplished medical professional. The incisions were neat, intentional, and indicated they had been made soon after death, as part of the embalming procedure. Yet Tutankhamun was not an isolated case. As more royal mummies underwent scrutiny with increasingly advanced methods, an alarming trend became apparent. Numerous pharaohs and aristocrats displayed indications of genital excision or alteration. Some had undergone complete castration. Others exhibited evidence of augmentation surgeries involving the introduction of foreign substances. The most startling finding emerged from the sepulchre of an anonymous prince from the 18th dynasty. His preserved body disclosed not only absent genitalia, but also proof that the extraction had been executed during his lifetime. Forensic examination of the skeletal framework and residual tissues implied this was neither a punitive measure nor an ishap, but a calculated sacred operation. Ancient Egyptian writings then began to acquire an unsettling coherence. Mentions of perfecting the deceased for the afterlife, accounts of readying the body for perpetual devotion to the gods, and directives for altering the departed to guarantee appropriate spiritual efficacy in a subsequent existence. The consequences were profound. If Egyptians habitually altered the genitalia of their deceased, what did this signify regarding their perspective on human sexuality and the body? Were these alterations exclusively post-mortem, or did they also mirror customs enacted upon the living? However, perhaps the most distressing aspect was the methodical manner in which Victorian archaeologists had suppressed this proof. When initial Egyptologists encountered overt sexual depictions or indications of genital modification, they did not merely disregard them. They vigorously quelled the information, withdrawing artifacts from public display and excising descriptions from formal accounts. For more than a century, the genuine scope of Egyptian sexual customs remained hidden. not due to ancient discretion, but because of contemporary embarrassment and Victorian moralistic rigidity that could not reconcile itself with what the evidence plainly revealed. Yet, the absent genitalia represented only the initial discovery made by archaeologists. The Egyptian system of sexual regulation functioned via an elaborate hierarchy that governed every facet of intimate existence. At its apex were the pharaohs, whose sexual prowess was deemed indispensable for Egypt's continuation. Beneath them, aristocrats and clergy endured immense compulsion to affirm their merit through sexual demonstrations and sacred dedication. At the lowest tier were household bondservants, especially minors, who confronted systemic maltreatment that was not merely endured but religiously commanded. Royal offspring, born into this framework, encountered an exceptionally dreadful destiny. Old Egyptian writings detail how privileged households would commit their youngest to temple service, where they would receive instruction in sexual skills from a tender age. These youngsters, some as young as 6 or 7, were indoctrinated that their physical forms were not their own, but belonged to the deities. The instruction was thorough and savage. Children were instructed in specific postures, methods for extending gratification, and techniques for sustaining excitement during prolonged sacred rites. They were conditioned to detach from their own corporeal feelings, to perceive their physical selves as implements rather than personal possessions. Medical papyri documented the bodily strain this tutelage inflicted upon youthful frames. Minors acquired enduring wounds from coercive flexibility drills. Their development was frequently impeded by inadequate sustenance, crafted to preserve youthful proportions favored by adult consumers. Many succumbed to internal wounds or ailments linked to premature, intimate engagements. However, the mistreatment far exceeded temple instruction. Affluent Egyptian households habitually exploited their household servants for enjoyment, with children being especially valued for their presumed innocence and pliability. Official records indicate that child bondservants could be acquired and traded exclusively for intimate functions, their worth ascertained by their age, outward appearance, and instruction. The psychological repercussions were catastrophic. Those who survived into adulthood exhibited indicators that contemporary psychologists would identify as profound trauma. They encountered challenges in establishing conventional relationships. Frequently, they developed sexual compulsions or became entirely reclusive, often perishing prematurely from what archaic texts delicately termed broken hearts. Perhaps most unsettling was the manner in which this mistreatment was rationalized through spiritual dogma. Priests proclaimed that intimate service to the deities represented the supreme act of reverence, and that children designated for such roles were favored, not victimized. Households were urged to perceive it as an honor when their offspring were chosen for temple responsibilities. Even when cognizant of the true reality of their fate, the financial aspect introduced an additional stratum of dread. Archaeological findings demonstrate a 73% fatality rate among children in temple service, with forensic examinations uncovering procedures that consumed as long as 6 hours. Affluent benefactors compensated handsomely for admittance to child bondservants, thus financing a methodical enterprise of maltreatment that persisted for thousands of years. Nevertheless, if you believe that constitutes the gravest ordeal Egyptian children confronted, you are unprepared for what follows. This structured abuse paled in comparison to the occurrences during the Feast of Drunkenness, Egypt's most infamous sacred celebration. The impending disclosure involves customs so intense that when pioneer archaeologists unearthed proof, they literally incinerated the records rather than rendering them for general viewing. The ensuing description will render everything you have just learned seem like a juvenile tale. The subsequent practice merges religious reverence with sexual aggression on a magnitude that would astonish even contemporary spectators. This involved an entire populace plunging into week-long revelries of disorder, and the archaeological findings confirm its actual occurrence precisely as chronicled by ancient accounts. Before delving into the most unsettling segment, please indicate your approval if you are prepared for the next revelation. And do leave a comment below to share your location. I find it remarkable that individuals globally are united by a shared intrigue regarding the more shadowed chapters of human history. The Feast of Drunkenness symbolized the ultimate zenith of Egyptian sexual radicalism, an annual observance dedicated to the goddess Hathor that converted the whole society into a 7-day period of aggression, intimacy, and spiritual anarchy. What commenced as an homage to divine womanhood morphed into an event that would be categorized as a humanitarian atrocity by current criteria. The genesis of the festival resided in Egyptian folklore, particularly the narrative of Sekhmet, the leonine deity who almost annihilated humankind in a state of inebriated fury. As per lore, the gods were compelled to inundate Egypt with beer, blended with red ochre, tricking Sekhmet into believing she consumed blood, thereby causing her to become so profoundly intoxicated that she abandoned her destructive quest and metamorphosed into the milder Hathor. This saga served as the blueprint for an annual commemoration that spurred every Egyptian to drink themselves into a condition of divine enthrallment. However, the festival transcended mere inebriation. Attendees held the conviction that in their inebriated condition, they became conduits for the deities themselves, empowered to indulge any impulse without ethical or legal repercussions. Preparations commenced months prior. Ecclesiastical officials would concoct vast volumes of beer, frequently incorporating mind-altering compounds extracted from lotus blossoms and other flora. The concoction produced more than just drunkenness. It induced vivid illusions and significantly diminished celestial. Those involved recounted experiencing apparitions, perceiving celestial utterances, and sensing occupation by otherworldly entities. Upon the festival's commencement, ordinary societal conventions entirely vanished. Masters engaged in sexual acts with bondservants in communal plazas. Spouses deserted their households to unite with wandering assemblies of merrymakers. Youngsters were exposed to explicit, intimate behaviors and frequently became active participants themselves. The whole society plunged into a state of disarray that endured for 7 days and nights. Historical writings depict scenarios that perturb even contemporary audiences. Aggregations of inebriated Egyptians would rampage through urban centers, breaching residences and compelling residents to partake in their festivities. Females were subjected to collective mistreatment, which was regarded as sacred fellowship. Males vied to ascertain who could sustain sexual excitement for the greatest durations while completely inebriated. The aggression was as severe as the sexuality. Attendees would assault one another with fervent sexual intensity, biting, scratching, and causing injuries deemed indicators of divine approval. Some participants perished from internal harm resulting from aggressive, intimate encounters. Others were crushed by throngs of inebriated celebrants navigating constricted pathways. The spiritual rationalization rendered everything even more unsettling. Clerics proclaimed that any deed executed during the observance was inherently sanctified, as participants were inhabited by divine essences. Maltreatment transformed into sacred fellowship. Aggression became a holy oblation. Child mistreatment was transmuted into a divine benediction. International observers recorded narratives that disclose global dismay at these festivities. Mesopotamian envoys characterized the festival as evidence that Egyptians were savages masquerading as a refined society. Certain monarchies declined to dispatch representatives to Egypt during festival durations, apprehensive for their well-being and moral purity. The repercussions of the festival were as traumatizing as the event itself. Participants frequently possessed no recollection of their intoxicated conduct, resulting in psychological distress upon discovering proof of their deeds. Households were fragmented when members ascertained the actions of their kin during the festivities. Children conceived 9 months post-festival endured social disgrace as progeny of divine enthrallment rather than conventional procreation. The financial repercussions were immense. Whole urban centers would suspend operations for a week as the populace indulged in inebriated merrymaking. Agrarian labor halted, commerce ceased, and governmental operations ceased completely. The expenditure in foregone output was considerable, yet pharaohs deemed it an essential cost for preserving cosmic equilibrium. The festival additionally fulfilled political objectives by offering an outlet for societal pressures. It permitted the Egyptian framework to uphold stringent social stratification for the majority of the year. Citizens were permitted to defy authority, masters could face degradation from servants, and societal conventions could be transgressed, but solely within this meticulously managed span of disorder. Archaeological substantiation affirms the severe character of these festivals. Investigations of temple locations uncover specialized compartments conceived for collective intimate acts, featuring attributes implying their utilization for aggressive and demeaning behaviors. The tangible proof aligns with the unsettling chronicles bequeathed by classical authors. The methodical erosion of Egyptian sexual customs commenced during the Ptolemaic era, when Hellenic sovereigns endeavored to enforce Mediterranean principles upon Egyptian sacred observances. The friction between Greek logic and Egyptian sexual esotericism generated a predicament that eventually dismantled both frameworks. The Ptolemies, notwithstanding their status as alien monarchs, felt obligated to partake in Egyptian religious celebrations to uphold credibility with their populace. Yet, their Hellenic sensitivities were appalled by the severe intimate customs they encountered. Cleopatra I endeavored to amend the Feast of Drunkenness, curtailing its duration and instituting restrictions on the aggression and public sexual acts. These alterations incited a spiritual emergency. Egyptian clergy contended that modifying the festival would provoke the deities and invite cosmic catastrophe. They cited natural calamities, military setbacks, and financial predicaments as proof that the gods were already discontent with external meddling in hallowed customs. The predicament reached its zenith under the sovereignty of Cleopatra III, who confronted the insurmountable challenge of appeasing both Egyptian spiritual aspirations and Roman political imperatives. Roman onlookers were outraged by Egyptian sexual practices, perceiving them as indicators of savagery and ethical decline. However, Egyptian priests menaced insurrection if ancestral festivals were completely forsaken. Cleopatra's resolution involved devising private iterations of the festivals for Egyptian spiritual leaders, while projecting a more restrained public image for Roman spectators. This accommodation pleased no faction and fostered an atmosphere of dissimulation that corroded both Egyptian ecclesiastical dominion and Roman political governance. The mistreatment of minors grew even more formalized during this epoch, as beleaguered rulers strived to demonstrate their fidelity to Egyptian customs while concealing the proof from Roman scrutiny. Young bondservants were illicitly traded in greater volumes, their abuse perpetrated within clandestine compartments that Roman functionaries were forbidden from accessing. The psychological burden on Egyptian populace was immense. Successive generations of children had been reared within a framework that validated sexual aggression and spiritual fanaticism. When external coercion necessitated alterations to these customs, numerous Egyptians underwent a type of societal trauma. They had forfeited not merely sacred customs, but their complete paradigm for comprehending intimacy and the divine connection. The ultimate downfall materialized with the Roman subjugation. In 30 BCE, Augustus Caesar was appalled by his troops' findings within Egyptian temples and promptly commanded the eradication of sexual religious customs. Roman military personnel demolished explicit artistry, incinerated spiritual writings, and put to death priests who declined to relinquish ancestral rites. However, the Romans did not solely quash Egyptian sexual practices. They methodically obliterated proof of their actuality. Sanctuaries were divested of overt embellishments, papyri detailing intimate rituals were burned, and even architectural components intended for sacred sexuality were demolished or obscured. The children ensnared within this system confronted an especially unfortunate destiny. Many had been so extensively indoctrinated for sexual service that they proved incapable of adjusting to conventional existence. Roman archives detail instances of former temple children who chose self-destruction rather than confronting an existence where their sole perceived worth had been nullified. The remaining individuals bore trauma that impacted Egyptian society for countless generations. The methodical sexual mistreatment had engendered patterns of conduct and conviction that could not be readily expunged by political subjugation. Roman administrators documented persistent issues with clandestine sexual sex, networks involved in the illicit trade of minors, and spiritual factions attempting to covertly reinstate ancestral customs. Nevertheless, even the Romans were unable to obliterate all the proof. What they left behind would astound Victorian archaeologists, compelling them to orchestrate the most significant concealment in the annals of archaeology. The structured suppression of Egyptian sexual customs commenced not with archaic intrigues, but with Victorian ethical sensitivities that could not confront the archaeological facts. When 19th-century investigators first came across overt sexual depictions in Egyptian sepulchres and sanctuaries, they confronted a cultural dilemma that influenced Egyptology for the subsequent 150 years. The precedent was set early on, when Giovanni Belzoni unearthed explicitly sexual murals in the tomb of Seti I in 1817. He promptly directed that they be concealed with plaster instead of being recorded. His published narrative portrayed the tomb as housing exquisite sacred tableaux, while entirely omitting the explicit sexual material that permeated several compartments. This became routine procedure throughout the Victorian epoch. Auguste Mariette, the progenitor of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, maintained private assortments of explicit relics that were never publicly exhibited. Upon the establishment of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, whole classifications of artifacts were consigned to limited access storage zones, accessible exclusively to male academics. The suppression extended beyond visual representations. Victorian interpreters habitually expurgated sexual material from ancient writings, substituting explicit portrayals with understated expressions, or merely omitting complete segments. The renowned Ebers Papyrus, a pivotal medical document from ancient Egypt, featured over 40 sections addressing sexual customs that remained untranslated until the 1970s. Possibly the most astonishing aspect was the methodical eradication of proof. British archaeologist Flinders Petrie openly confessed to obliterating artifacts he judged too indecent for general viewing. His diaries detail the incineration of papyri, the shattering of effigies, and the reburial of relics that depicted intimate acts he found himself unable to record. The concealment broadened to include educational establishments. Institutions of higher learning declined to finance investigations into Egyptian sexuality, deeming it unsuitable for academic inquiry. Learners who exhibited an interest in these subjects were dissuaded or expelled. Academic periodicals declined submissions that explored sexual customs, even when substantiated by robust archaeological findings. Museums devised intricate schemes for obscuring sexual artifacts. The British Museum, for instance, possesses over 2,800 suppressed Egyptian relics stored in limited access sections merely labeled as various pottery or ornamental pieces. As recently as 2019, the Louvre was observed concealing newly unearthed papyri from public exhibition. Even Wikipedia entries concerning these subjects are inexplicably protected from modification. Patrons who explicitly request to observe these articles confront administrative hurdles, intended to deter incidental interest. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York upholds comparable constraints. Their Egyptian exhibits present expurgated renditions of tomb murals, with explicit sexual material either obscured or digitally erased. The authentic artifacts persist in storage, accessible solely to scholars, capable of demonstrating a valid academic necessity and consenting to rigorous confidentiality mandates. Even presently, this Victorian inheritance persists in molding public perceptions of ancient Egypt. Widely disseminated documentaries and museum displays emphasize political chronicles, spiritual convictions, and artistic accomplishments, while entirely disregarding the sexual customs that formed the core of Egyptian civilization. The outcome is a purified portrayal of history that bears scant likeness to the intricate and frequently unsettling actuality of ancient Egyptian existence. This continuous obfuscation has engendered substantial voids in general comprehension concerning human sexuality, sacred rituals, and societal structure within one of history's most impactful civilizations. The atrocities concealed within Egyptian sepulchres and writings expose the ease with which spiritual piety can transmute into methodical mistreatment, when human intimacy is wielded as an instrument of cosmic governance. For 3 millennia, Egyptian civilization instituted and upheld customs that regarded minors as sexual assets, legitimized aggression as sacred adoration, and employed intimacy as an instrument of political supremacy. If this brief insight into history's concealed grimness has stimulated your desire to unearth further buried verities, I have arranged another excursion into the historical shadows that you will not wish to overlook. Select the video now, visible on your display, to unveil an additional astonishing episode that history endeavored to expunge. And if you found this inquiry as captivating as I did, please activate the subscription option so we may persist in meticulously uncovering history's strata collectively. These overlooked narratives merit recognition, and a multitude of further stories await their telling.